Hello, and welcome to the 16th episode of Did You Know, in which I, Chris Lloyd, try to shed some light on a strange and wonderful historical fascination using the archives of the Northern Echo. Now, did you know about our region's worst air disaster, in which 6 RAF men were killed when an air show at RAF Middleton St George, now Teesside Airport, of course, went tragically wrong? Well, let me explain. Now, after the Second World War, the RAF started holding at home days, as it called them, as a bit of a PR exercise. Local people were invited to drop in at their local airbase and visit the RAF at home. And right into the 1960s, these annual at-home events drew huge crowds. As this picture, this is before Middleton St George became Teesside Airport, before it became a civilian airport. And you can see the size of the crowd there. But the second one of these at-homes on September the 17th, 1949, went terribly, terribly wrong. In front of a crowd of 7,000 people, including at least one of the wives of the airmen who would die. The climax of the air show was when a mock invasion tried to take control of the airfield control tower. Tanks began rolling towards it, and then overhead, Wellington bombers flew at 300 feet and dropped dummy parachutists, which drifted gently down to earth. In Wellington NC 430, this is just any old Wellington, the dummies have been held in place in the bomb bay by a light cord which was cut to release them so they could drift down to earth. But tragically, the cord then became tangled around the elevators on the tails plane, causing the pilot to lose control of the aircraft, so it plunged down into the airfield. According to the Echo, it slithered across the grass and exploded in a fireball. The paper said many of the spectators thought that the crash was part of the show. One eyewitness told us that he thought at first that the plane was an old glider which had been allowed to crash to give a touch of realism to the scene, and it was not until ambulances and fire tenders went to the spot that he realised that it was a crash, that it really was a crash. Then the paper says the tenders, the ambulances, and the rescue squads were on the scene in a few seconds, but the plane soon burned out, and there was no hope for the men trapped inside. So all 6 were killed outright. They were the pilot, Flight Officer John McPherson, whose address was given as the married quarters at RAF Middleton St George, and his 2 senior officers, who both came from Redcar, Barry Tatham and Robert Wilson. The other 3 on board appear to have been cadets or apprentices. There was Signaller Henry Chapman, Donald Hall, and Ronald Munday. Now, 3 of the dead were buried in Darlington in what appears to have been a full military funeral. One of the dead was taken home to Seaham, and the 2 officers, Barry Tatham and Robert Wilson, were taken back to their hometown of Redcar for burial. A couple of months later, a court-martial at Middleton St George heard that the tying of the dummies with the light cord was, open quotes, unorthodox with an element of danger. And the squadron leader, Christopher Reed, was reprimanded. But things went no further than that. Indeed, looking at the old papers, it's amazing that there wasn't a greater furore. There wasn't any furore about the incident. Perhaps that was because it came so hard on the heels of the end of the Second World War, where people were still so used to servicemen dying in ridiculously large quantities. And perhaps it was because in those days aircraft regularly fell out of the sky and killed their crew. The fields around Middleton St George are peppered with the remains of jets from the 1940s and 1950s that just tumbled out of the sky and crashed into the ground. Now, although time moved on, those closest to the six airmen clearly could not forget. For example, um, Flight Lieutenant Bob Wilson. He was from Redcar. He was only 25 when he died. He'd grown up in the town. He'd attended Coton Grammar School. He'd excelled as a swimmer. He joined the RAF a year or so before the war ended. He'd then served in Egypt for 3 years, and he'd married a Redcar girl, Maureen. In fact, he is the chap on the right here, and the picture on the left, if I get rid of myself, you will see that that's not him, I don't think, but he's written a message there in the bottom left-hand corner. It begins with a name that I cannot work out, and then his message says, so-and-so, who took Maureen on her first plane, and she said it would be her last. All the best, Bob. So I guess that's a souvenir he sent back, a little light-hearted souvenir he sent back to her from Egypt. And Maureen was the wife who was mentioned in the Echo's headline about the disaster as being present on that fateful, awful day at Middleton St George. She watched alongside her sister and her cousin as Bob died in a fireball. She never remarried, but she kept Bob's effects largely untouched. And when she died several years ago, they were auctioned and bought by an RAF enthusiast who began researching the story. He then approached the Friends of Redcar Cemetery to see if they knew where Bob was buried. And then it emerged that although Barry Tatum had been buried beneath a headstone, Bob's grave was unmarked. The Military of Defence said his family had been offered a stone, but for whatever reason, it never came to pass. And so the Friends sprang into action. Their secretary, Dorothy Ahmed, told me, we felt that Robert, with his war record, should not lie in an unmarked grave and that he deserved a proper RAF memorial, although this has not been easy to achieve. So after 3 years of fundraising and battling officialdom, the Friends have raised enough money and the headstone is being carved from proper military Portland stone over in Wales, ready for unveiling next Saturday, July the 22nd, that's 2023, at 10:30, and all are welcome. And so this seems a fitting end to the story of the region's worst air disaster. Bob Wilson, one of the 6 men who died when the air show at what is now Teesside Airport went terribly wrong 74 years ago, is to be remembered at last. So, thank you so much for your time. Please subscribe so that you don't miss another episode of the magnificent Did You Know? And why not dash over to the Northern Echoes website, where you will find that every morning at 9:30 a.m. I post a historical story in a similar vein. And there are loads of ways over there that you can subscribe there too. I think at the moment there's a flash sale on, so that's bound to be a great bargain. Thank you for watching Did You Know? And now you can say that, yes, you do know about the region's worst air disaster in which 6 men lost their lives at what is now Teesside Airport. Bye for now.